Hi there, Nick Dowell. I'm from Tasmania, the potential pilot for tobacco-free generation. Part of a large coalition supporting it, along with Margaret Chan, supporter. But one of the challenges, our government has breached Article 5.3. 2/3 of the current policy has been written by Imperial Tobacco. And so we really have a big task to build a coalition in support of actually getting at, I guess, the TFG, the tobacco-free generation, up. So I guess the question is, a lot of people here have been coming to me with offering support, but to you, how would you go about building the support around these things which are clearly globally unique and quite challenged to get up? There's probably 2 or 3 of you on the panel that could probably offer good advice.
Well, I'll have a go at that. My first advice would be to invite Prabhat Jha to visit Tasmania, as he did last weekend, and meet leading politicians. I think that should have some impact. Second, I think we need to draw public attention to the breaches in relation to Article 5.3 and keep hammering that. Because if an Australian government is in breach of Article 5.3, that means Australia is in breach of Article 5.3. And we've had bipartisan support for tobacco control and in particular for the FCTC. So I think it has to be it is the full glare of publicity that needs to be placed on them, and nationally as well as locally. Politicians don't like to be embarrassed. They don't like to feel that they're breaching international agreements, and it certainly is not good publicity for politicians to be playing with the tobacco industry. So I'd be giving it absolutely as much publicity as you can.
Thank you.
Diane Finegood, Simon Fraser, University, Canada. So one of the positives in Canada is we do have a Minister of Health who's a physician and who's actually interested in tobacco control, and there was recently a national forum for tobacco control. The panel has talked a lot about and alluded to the importance of deeply held beliefs in retaining sort of smoking. So Colin pointed that we haven't reached that antisocial paradigm yet in the Pacific. And I was at this meeting, and one of the anecdotal things that was said to me, it seems a very powerful paradigm which may be challenging to address. So in Indigenous communities in Canada, there's still pretty high rates of smoking, as I suspect there probably are in Australia as well. And somebody pointed out that in some Indigenous communities, tobacco is seen as a form of harm reduction because it's less harmful than alcohol. So how are we going to work with that kind of a paradigm to change smoking behavior? Because that's a pretty tough one to work with, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right that the rates of smoking, as we've looked at in First Nations, as they're called in Canada, Indigenous populations, are higher, and they have not seen as substantial reductions, certainly in the US, as has been achieved in other populations in tobacco-to-rail mortality. But I think one of the things that could help would actually to get some cross-country comparisons of the Indigenous populations in New Zealand, Australia, the US, and in Canada, on the extent to which there is a divergence with the non-Indigenous populations in a very achievable public health strategy. At the heart of that, as you well know, would be to try to generate support from within the community for doing more things on tobacco. Now, the other dynamic that's peculiar to Canada, but is worth sharing, is at least some of the Indigenous reserves and the Natives reserves in Ontario crossed the border and were a conduit for the tobacco industry funded smuggling. So that is the dynamic. But there are practical solutions. The former Premier of Manitoba had a very simple solution for how to get rid of tax-free sales on the reserves. And what they said was, you pay the tax up front, but keep tabs, and at the end of the year, we'll refund you that entire amount plus a premium. So effectively, that was distributing money from the smoker to the community. So there are innovations that are possible. I think we need the same principles. We need indigenous-led research, and we need to focus on the same issues, generating demand for a leading cause of avoidable mortality in those communities. And that applies, I think, to all 4 countries.
Just to add, I am aware in New Zealand, some of the indigenous programs already show benefit. Smoking Not Our Future, for example, in indigenous communities there, and there might be someone here who knows more about it, have shown remarkable reduction in smoking in Māori young people. For us in the Pacific, it's a little bit more complicated, of course, because some of these communities, tobacco is incorporated into gifting as part of cultural practices. Some of the community leaders and the politicians will say one thing and do something else. Many of them are smokers themselves, so they would sign up to an agreement, but the credibility of that is in question because they don't generally support the actions that need to follow. I agree with Pravat completely. Perhaps a piece of work comparing the experiences, particularly the ones that have made an impact in the indigenous communities, might be shared across. It's a hard one for us in the region because there's a lot of tolerance for many things. So if you think about violence against women, for example, small communities generally, I don't know, more accepting, I guess, and smoking, as I made mention, it's tolerated and people generally don't say anything about it. What do you do about it? Obviously, a number of things. I was very interested in the presentation on mass media campaign because that's something that we don't do, can't afford and so on, but I'm sure there are reasonable programs in Australia and New Zealand in particular that might easily be adapted for use and so on. I think there's some very practical things we can do to address this, but at the heart of it, of course, is the kind of emotional awareness, if you like, or attitudes towards smoking.
Okay, we've got one down the front and then Emily at the back.
Good afternoon, panel. My name is Sneha Lakhotia. I'm an epidemiologist from India. We've spoken a lot about the fight against tobacco in terms of smoking, but there are other forms of tobacco, smoke-free tobacco, and other ways people consume tobacco rather than just cigarettes. There's not much talk or action against it. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. You're providing free advertising for our forthcoming paper on BMJ, which talks about smokeless tobacco. There's something like 260 million users of tobacco in the South Asia region, which is the most dominant, including 92 million women. And we know that the epidemiological studies have shown that women who chew tobacco have higher incidence and mortality from oral cancer, despite chewing less tobacco per day than men. And that's a curiosity, but it needs to be further investigated. Now, in terms of control, I think, unfortunately, as you well know, the smokeless industry is a series of small companies that, or small enterprises, which are very hard to regulate, let alone tax. But I think there is important elements. All the efforts related to counter-advertising certainly apply for smokeless tobacco. The use of warning labels can be made practicable. And I think one should go further and do more investigative journalism on the fact that despite the sense that these are somewhat wholesome, small cottage industries, effectively, they're controlled by a few families, few wealthy families who have split them into thousands of pieces to avoid taxes. So I think we need to try to encourage journalists to try to cover and expose the fact that this is just organized tax evasion. And the recommendations that we've given the government very much are start with the basic. Try to register all of the different manufacturers, make sure they have a proper tax number, and then try to make sure you get details on how the tobacco is produced. Those basic things are required before we could consider taxation as one of the strategies for smokeless tobacco.
I'd like to thank the panel for a really terrific expose of the current issues. I actually just wanted to offer a little bit of data with respect to not the last question, but the question before, which is about Indigenous smoking or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander smoking in Australia. And I think one of the issues that we've faced is a general deficit model of the way that these things are being reported, because there have actually been substantive successes in reducing in Indigenous tobacco in Australia. And I'd like to quote some results on a forthcoming paper that is led by Ray Lovett, who's an Aboriginal epidemiologist working at the Australian National University. And they find that tobacco daily smoking prevalence was around 50% among Aboriginal communities in 2004-2005, and that has fallen to 41.4%, which is an 8.6% decrease in absolute terms up to over a 10-year period. So although, and that is actually comparable to the 6.8% absolute decrease we've seen in the general population in Australia. And I think because people have tended to report on relative decreases rather than absolute decreases, there's been this concern about things moving slowly, but in fact those decreases are comparable, and Australia is being held up as an international world leader in tobacco control, but the control within Aboriginal communities is not being framed in the same way. So although we agree, I think all of us can agree those are high smoking prevalences, I would like to sort of echo some of the words of the panel to say that we do really need to build our successes, and particularly for communities who are working incredibly hard to reduce their smoking prevalences. I think it's really important. And I think maybe I can now that I've done a short speech disguised as a question, one thing I would like to ask the panel is, as an epidemiologist, I think there is a lot in the way that we report these data, and I think that what we've heard is a variety of relative prevalences, absolute numbers, and I just wonder if anyone on the panel would like to comment on what they think is most powerful in those statistics.
Prabhat, that sounds like one for you.
Well, I mean, epidemiologists care about rates, and politicians care about absolute numbers. So I think having data, as you've done nicely, on just how many absolute deaths are occurring in different populations and the absolute numbers of smokers. And very practically, they're concerned not just about past deaths, but about future voters. So I think always having some statistic, and we owe a debt of gratitude to Richard Pito for helping us think this through. We should be talking about the consequences on people who are alive today, people who are smoking today, and not kind of in abstract about, well, what were past death rates. And I think if we do that, we can communicate epidemiological data, powerful data, much better to politicians.
Martin first, perhaps, Mark?
And I'd just add to that I think we can do much more with infographics rather than producing the standard Excel graphs and so on with bars and columns and so on, but to think imaginatively about new ways of presenting the data, and particularly mapping it, because politicians often like to look at their own constituencies and see where it lies in relation to other groups. So using more innovative ways of actually visually projecting the data.
I think it's a tremendously important issue. Theme, the way that epidemiologists can present data. Donkeys years ago, I talked about what I call creative epidemiology, which some people translated as making up the numbers, which wasn't what I meant. It was about doing the kind of thing that Richard Pito has done, that Konrad Jamrzyk and Darcy Holman and others have done, which is to keep finding new ways of presenting the data that you have, because for you, or as a scientist, you publish a paper in a journal and that's it. But there are always new ways of presenting the data that will have an impact on politicians. It can be you can break it up into various ways. You can talk about projections and what will be happening in the years ahead. As Martin said, you can talk about local data, what's going to be happening in your electorate. And the first time that we did that, I think, was in, heaven help us, in Scotland in 1981, the Scottish epidemic, where we looked at, first time we looked at smoking mortality by electorate. So there is a raft, I think, of new ways in which the data can be presented, and that's what we need from epidemiologists. And what we also need is that when they are publishing data, and you've done this brilliantly, is that they make it public, that it doesn't just appear in a journal somewhere, but there's a bloody good press release going out with it, and it's drawn in it, and it goes out on at an appropriate time, not at midnight on Saturday or something like that. So I think for epidemiologists, it's just keep coming up with new ways, come up with new data, but also come up with new ways of presenting the data that we have that will impact on politicians and media.
Thank you. My name is Robert Beaglehall from New Zealand. I'd like to thank the panel for their stimulating contributions, and from which I take lots of optimism. My question for the panel is, do you see a scope for reformulation of combustible tobacco in the sense of removing menthol, flavouring, sugar, and perhaps reducing nicotine content? And perhaps Melanie, you might want to start.
Sounds like a setup.
Not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point we do have to get to the stage of regulating the product itself. And, I mean, we can do something about menthol now. We don't have to wait. Many other countries have done that already. You know, I think that we're probably suffering some regulatory chill at the moment here until after the WTO ruling is in. But for me, you know, I think that is part of the future. The path we have to go down. We have to do something about filter venting. You know, we really have to get inside the pack, literally, and do something about what's actually in those products, because the voluntary disclosure information is incomplete, probably misleading, nobody understands it, it's not contextualised. So people are likely being falsely reassured about what's in products. We already know some of the work that's been done in the UK and in New Zealand has shown that people are hold a lot of false beliefs about some of the different brands, that some of them might be perhaps less harmful than others, that roll your own tobacco might be less harmful than factory made tobacco, which is completely wrong, simply not true. People think that filter vented cigarettes, they taste lighter and smoother, and mentholated cigarettes taste smoother. Those products are just as likely to kill you as all the others. So I mean, for communication issues, that's a big issue for the future, how we actually address that. But the underlying issue is actually doing something about the product and really, you know, regulating what's part of it. Martin, I think you wanted to...
Well, as you know, in Europe we do have the Tobacco Products Directive, and it's not as, I mean, we would have liked it to have moved faster, but menthol will be removed by, I think, 2020. I think a more interesting argument is to whether we should be looking at the nicotine content of cigarettes. And, you know, we discussed it the other day, Robert, there is some evidence that might suggest that by taking the nicotine out of cigarettes, you might actually make them a lot less attractive. I think it's worth looking at and thinking about whether we want to progressively reduce that, because I think we are now getting into a situation where the industry is moving into the marketing of nicotine rather than tobacco, with a lot of problems potentially connected with that.
Hi, my name's Doug Tutt. I'm a somewhat retired Director of Health Promotion from New South Wales. I just wanted to suggest that we shouldn't be too self-congratulatory in Australia about our successes. Somebody before was talking about that. Because in many ways I feel a little bit like we might have stalled on tobacco control in Australia when we look at our figures. and we're not advancing as quickly as what we did. And I would also suggest that if I was a tobacco company executive, I'd wake up every morning blessing obesity, because it is a big enough health problem to have lots of us worried about, and it's not tobacco. Over the years, I think we've gone from, we used to call it, when I started, we used to call it anti-smoking type stuff, concentrating on the smoker. We became much more sensible and concentrated on the product and calling it tobacco control. Is it time now that we're courageous enough to move on and as public health people and talk about tobacco elimination?
Perhaps if I could make a start on, in terms of your first contribution. I think, I don't know about Australia, but I think in the Pacific, we are stalled. There was a hive of activity around the FCTC process, and immediately after that, when countries were getting legislation in place and so on, but somehow I think we might have taken the eye off the ball. And as I made mention in my brief presentation, I think we're stalled. And somehow we've got to re-energize this whole activity, at least in our part of the world. Your reference to obesity is right, because I think somehow when you concentrate your limited resources on one problem, you take your eye off the ball on the other one, and it does set you back. So it's an issue that has enormous interest to us, because these things are challenging in their own right, and there's some crossovers, as you know, in terms of how we might communicate them. Elimination, I guess that's the ultimate objective, but I think for us anyway, we're a long way away from that. And I think, as I said earlier on, we've got to re-energize the work and to seek a renewed interest from governments. We have a very lethargic or non-existent civil society sector on this issue. So it's not as if we can rely on them. We have to push ahead with what we have.
I think Mel had something on. Yeah, I think in most countries it's never a path of linear progress in tobacco control. It seems to me that you often take 2 steps forward and then you're dealing with the 1 step back that has been delivered to you. So, you know, Australia, while we've done well with plain packaging and getting to, you know, large tax increases and things like that, I think we're probably experiencing the 1 step back at the moment, which is the tobacco industry working very, very hard to undermine some of the tax increases that we have seen and are destined to happen in the future, by using various price discounting strategies, by pricing roll your own much cheaper than factory made, and people moving to roll your own tobacco. You know, the tobacco industry is exploiting everything it possibly can, pushing back against plain packaging, falsely reassuring smokers about particular brands that they imply are less harmful and so forth. So it's like a many-headed hydra that you're dealing with, that mythical creature with many snake heads, and you cut one head off and all the others come at you, and the one that you've cut off grows back. So I don't feel like there's any sense that we might be resting on our laurels here. I feel that we are engaged in a quite a difficult long-term chess game. And we make a move and they make a move back. And sometimes you can anticipate what they're going to do, and other times they surprise you. And sometimes we surprise them as well. But there's no doubt that it takes a hell of a lot of persistence and determination to make progress in tobacco control. And one of the things that I'm always encouraged about when I come to conferences like this is how much passion and determination people have to make a difference. And that, I think, can overcome a lot of the difficulties that we have faced and we know we will face in the future.
I think sorry. Yeah, I'd really like to endorse what Mike said earlier. I think we really need to keep our eye on the industry. They have a long history of defining the narrative, and we need to challenge that. There's no reason why we shouldn't be eliminating tobacco, and in fact, many governments have committed to tobacco-free countries in New Zealand and elsewhere. And if we look at the history of all of this, the way in which, we showed, Mark Pettigrew and I showed how the tobacco industry invented the idea of type A personality as a cause of cardiovascular disease, pure invention. I think it was Lisa Barrow who showed how they invented the idea of sick building syndrome as a way of diverting attention towards photocopiers and printers and away from second-hand smoke. My favorite one is Tom Novotny's work showing how the Keep America Beautiful campaign was invented by the tobacco industry so they would control it and it wouldn't draw attention to what was then about 50% of the trash that was lying around being tobacco related, but would focus on everything else. And we're now seeing them fight back. I've just done a piece which I shared with Mike last night for an Italian journal. We were looking at Viscount Ridley, Matt Ridley, who writes for The Times in London, is a well-known climate change skeptic and supporter of Brexit and all the usual things. And he was making the case in an article. He said, there is no evidence that smoke-free policies reduce myocardial infarctions, and he attacked the study in Helena, Montana and elsewhere. Well, of course, there's masses of evidence there. So we're seeing them doubting the evidence on smoking bans in public places. Pascal D. Tellem and I and some others looked at the way in which the University of Zurich researchers there had manipulated the data on the plain packs from Australia. And so I think constant vigilance, recognize that they keep coming back, they keep using front groups, they're working in all sorts of ways. That wouldn't surprise me, in fact, if there's somebody from the industry in the audience today somewhere, because they usually do infiltrate them into organizations like this, as we know, and then they write reports, and Mike has many examples of that from the past. So keep focused on the industry, and why that's really important is that there are people in the public health community, and they include groups like people in Public Health England, God help us, who are actually arguing that we need to engage with them in terms of harm reduction, electronic cigarettes and smoke not burn and various other products. We absolutely should not be engaging with them at all. We should not be going to the conferences that they fund. But unfortunately, there are some, well, I would say poor deluded people who think that that is actually legitimate, and I think it's completely not legitimate in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, look, I never know whether the glass is half full or half empty. And sure, we've made, I think there's enough coming through from here that I think we're all pretty much in the same, presenting the same approach, that sure, we've made progress despite extraordinary opposition, and sure, we should celebrate some of that progress, and sure, it's happening in areas that people don't often talk about, and Emily, you gave a good example there, but the problem's there, and it's still with us, and it's still massive, and it's where and so of course we failed. On the other hand, there are tiny numbers of us. I was trying to point out this morning how few people there are who are actually involved in full-on body and soul campaigning. And I can think of on tobacco, I can think of very few. It's all in addition to the day job. It's, it's getting the research grants and doing this and doing that. And then advocacy in the remaining 4 hours of the 24. It's people who are working in organizations running programs. There's no funding for advocacy. And yet that's what ultimately can make a heap of difference. So, yeah, half full, half empty, I don't know. But we absolutely have to keep at it. Mel, I just want to make a couple of side comments. Mel said it's a bit like a chess game, I think it was. And I have a personal slight frustration with the term endgame that I hear being used occasionally, because I'm a chess player. And I know a few things about the endgame. I know that it's always the longest part of the game. And I also know that you can win and you can draw and you can lose. And I think the end game is altogether the wrong term. Should we be talking about elimination? Of course, that's a long-term goal. But somebody else, somebody else talked about noble targets. And, you know, they're great. I see countries saying we'll get to such and such by whenever. And for some of them, it's just baloney. I mean, there's not a chance that they're going to get there. Do you remember we were going to have in this country no child will live in poverty by, when was it going to be, 2000 or something? And we're health for all by this and that. And then we had the MDGs and so on. So I think we've got to be a bit realistic in our targets. Of course, we should have some aspirational targets. Let's set some realistic targets too and see if we can get to those. And coming back to the question about epidemiology, let's have our epidemiologists tell us what can be achieved in human terms, in numbers, in terms of mortality and so on, if we get to those targets.
Can I have one very brief? We've got a couple of people waiting very patiently.
Sure. Just a quick comment on targets, and I draw from Richard Dahl's experience. When he first got the results of the British doctor study, he published them in the British Medical Journal, and the doctors would come home, read the journal, and say, my goodness, this is killing not just patients, but it's killing us. And many of them quit. But if you look at the last round that Richard Dahl reported on, still 5% of UK doctors, obviously very educated, directly involved in studies on themselves that showed the excess mortality, 5% continued to smoke. So is that a plausible goal that we could get in terms of a prevalence? Possibly. And I believe the Canadian government is thinking about a quantification of a goal along that lines. And I favor that because it's more realistic and you can try to think about what can you work backwards to achieve that level of prevalence. And it, rather than thinking about elimination, because it's very different than trying to eliminate yellow fever or measles. It involves very different sets of public health strategies and public support for those. But I think a 5% goal would be a plausible one.
Okay. Gentleman down here.
Peter Trabilko from the University of New South Wales and who have the honour to be a life member of the Public Health Association of Australia. Firstly, thank you all very much indeed for a most entertaining and informative exchange of ideas. Very valuable. Nobody has mentioned morbidity at all, only mortality. And could I think as an image that might start getting through to some other people, the older person with emphysema on perpetual oxygen supply, almost immobile? That would be a nice image to have instead of a sporting country. I'm not sure about that. Now, I want to join with Mike Daub because he knows what I'm going to talk about. I've suggested quite seriously that we tell the tobacco companies that they have exactly 3 years to stop selling cigarettes that have any nicotine in them at all. And we have an act in Australia, and you probably do everywhere else. Nicotine is a poison. It's listed, it's one of the most dangerous poisons known to human beings. Agatha Christie made a fortune out of poisoning people with nicotine, and it's still possible. So they're selling not something that is legally available, they're selling poison. And that should be a sufficient reason for stopping them. And I don't see any reason for not saying, you've got 2 years to either get rid of the nicotine out of the cigarettes or close down and go away. Thank you.
Mike, do you want to briefly?
Look, Peter, first of all, I applaud all the work you've done in public health over many, many years. It's just great to see you here. Second, my friend, colleague Kingsley Faulkner, who was president of the Australasian College of Surgeons, has said something similar. He's been a bit more generous. He said that there should be something like a 10-year period. And there are comparisons with Hong Kong. If you'd said to them, you'll hook up with China in 5 years, would have been impossible, but give it a longer term perspective and it was sort of accepted. So I think we should be looking at all these options. I think there really are some options to look at and we should test them in the political market.
Yeah, Pascal Dietelman and I did write a paper on that a number of years ago, and in fact, the hook that we put it onto was, if you remember the massacre at Utøya in Oslo, and Anders Breivik was searching on the internet for a poison that could be put into the heads of dum-dum bullets, and he found that nicotine was the most effective poison because it was relatively heat stable, and you could buy it easily, and it was incredibly toxic when you use it in that way. I mean, he didn't do it in the end, but yeah, you're right, it is a poison. Even in much lower doses, we're now recognizing much more its impact on tumor spread, not causing cancers, but on angiogenesis, and so on, its impact on the developing brain. And it keeps coming back to my point about nicotine being not as safe as people often think.
I think we've got probably 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you. Yael Barziv, I'm a public health physician from Israel and currently a PhD student here in Australia. You touched very briefly on the emerging new products such as e-cigarette and the heat not burn. And to me, the biggest challenge is what you just said in your answer a few minutes ago, that this is actually a topic that's dividing the public health community, where you can see public health experts advocating very strongly in favor of those products and other public health experts exactly opposite to that. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, you find a very small number of people who are doing it, but those very small number of people are working through many different organizations, so it's the same names coming up again and again and again, whether they be through Public Health England or CRUK or the Royal College of Physicians, but it is the same small group of people, and it is a few countries. As you know, in Israel, there is a current scandal about this, where the health minister has questions to answer about the content of envelopes that he received and money that has passed by, and there's a very good piece in Haaretz on it if people want to look at that. So I think people are looking at Israel with interest, but probably less in terms of tobacco policy and more in terms of corruption, I think. I've been traveling, so I haven't seen that, but I'm delighted to hear it because my Israeli colleagues were horrified by what was happening, and as you know, there was an expose on Israeli television about it.
Hello, Jenna from Central Australia. Having worked previously in the Pacific, I just wanted to touch more on your comment, Colin, about the stalling of activities. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression that Tonga last year just launched a mass media campaign in tobacco. They also launched a quit line and were looking at also M-Health activities. I'm just interested as to why you aren't celebrating this success, or whether there's been an evaluation that's shown that this wasn't successful.
One sparrow doesn't make it spring is an expression. Tonga has done a number of things in NCD around fresh fruit, taking taxes off that and distributing seedlings to farmers. I mean, they're the poster boy or the poster girl in our region. But it doesn't make for a coherent, consolidated, determined approach across the region is the point I'm making. And this is our challenge. We get busy around something and then something else comes along and everybody moves on to that. And it's an assessment. It's my impression compared to where we were. There was a lot of activity and good intentions, but it seems to have slowed down. I note the point that Melanie made, that I guess that this is, instead of 1 back, we're 3 back, 2 forwards. So it's an assessment of overall where we are and where we need to be. I gave you the tobacco-free goal, which I think is commendable. That's a less than 5% prevalence, by the way. But there isn't a lot of activity that one would expect that helped to drive us to get to where we are. After all, it's not going to happen without a determined effort. We've heard a lot about the activities of the tobacco industry. So my definition of stalling is simply that. We are not doing as much, or we are not as determined as we need to be given the size of the problem that we're facing.
Okay, so I think Mike had originally suggested that I put some notes together to draw the session to an end, but it's been so far-reaching I'm not even going to try. But I thought I'd close the session perhaps with one final thought. I mentioned at the start that one of the constants from 2005 has been the industry that's going to stop at nothing to change this. But I think it's important to recognise there's another constant in the war, and that's the people like you in the room, or like us in the room, who are working to protect public health. So I think we've got to take home with us the idea that we're smarter, we're more innovative, we're more passionate, we're more determined. We perhaps need to be more ruthless. We perhaps need to be more vigilant. We need to bring out our inner warriors to tackle the Hydra, as Mel puts it. But I think it's important to remember that the people, not profit, that's who's giving us strength. And I think no matter the size or the number of the challenges, we will not give up the fight. So on that note, could I please ask you to thank Martin McKee, Colin Tukatonga, Prabhat Jha, Melanie Wakefield and Mike Daub.